It wasn't the engine that made her pause. It was the silence of the man who never tried to prove her wrong. The engine purred low and clean, smoother than it had any right to be after dying cold just 30 minutes earlier. And Victoria Hale sat still behind the wheel, fingers resting lightly on the leather, her phone face down for once. The world outside the windshield dim and distant under the muted glow of the underground garage lights, because something about the moment refused to be rushed. Something about the way that sound came back to life without noise, without spectacle, without anyone asking for credit. And her reflection in the rearview mirror didn't look like the woman who had walked down here earlier in heels that echoed like authority against concrete. Back when everything had still made sense. Back when problems had clear hierarchies and solutions came with invoices and titles. And then the moment fractured, rewinding quietly to the beginning, to the sharp staccato of a failed ignition, to the faint smell of overheated metal, to the flicker of irritation crossing her face as she stepped out of the car, one hand already reaching for her phone, already calculating time lost in dollars per minute, already deciding this inconvenience belonged to someone else. And the garage felt colder then, more mechanical, filled with the distant hum of ventilation fans and the occasional drip of water somewhere unseen. And that was when she noticed him, not fully, not really, just enough to register a presence near the edge of her world, a man in a faded uniform pushing a janitor's cart, movement steady, unhurried, as if time bent differently around him. And a little girl sat cross-legged nearby with a backpack too big for her frame, pencil moving in small, careful strokes across a workbook, neither of them looking up, neither reacting to the expensive frustration idling beside them. And Victoria turned away almost immediately because nothing about them fit into the problem she needed solved, because people like that were background, part of the architecture of places like this, necessary but unseen. And when the engine refused again, sharper this time, she exhaled through her nose, impatience tightening her shoulders, and without thinking, without really looking, she let the words fall in the direction of the man as she dropped the key fob lightly onto the metal edge of his cart. Just a janitor, you can't fix this, her voice calm, practiced, not cruel in tone but absolute in assumption. The kind of sentence built from years of being obeyed, and the sound of it seemed to hang for a second longer than expected, not because it was loud, but because nothing came back to meet it. No defense, no offense, not even acknowledgement. And that absence, that quiet refusal to engage, shifted something almost imperceptible in the air, like a note slightly out of tune. And though she didn't turn yet, didn't give him her attention, something about the stillness behind her made the garage feel less like a place she controlled and more like a place she had yet to understand. Marcus Reed did not reach for the key right away, not because he hesitated, but because he listened first, his head tilting just slightly, as if the space itself had something left to say. And the faint ticking sound from the cooling engine lingered beneath the hum of the garage ventilation, a rhythm most people would miss entirely. But to him it carried information, subtle and precise, like a language learned over years without ever needing a classroom. And Lily glanced up from her workbook, her pencil pausing mid-word as she watched her father the way she always did in moments like this, not curious, not surprised, just quietly attentive, because she had seen this before, the way he let silence do the work before his hands ever moved. And Victoria shifted her weight impatiently, her heel tapping once against the concrete before she caught herself, the sound sharper than she intended, because something about being ignored unsettled her more than confrontation ever could. And still he said nothing. Still he did not look at her, only at the car, or more precisely, through it, as though the polished surface meant nothing compared to what lay beneath it. And after a few seconds that stretched longer than they should have, he finally picked up the key fob with a calm, unhurried motion, turning it once in his hand like he was feeling its weight rather than inspecting its design. And when he spoke, his voice was low and even, carrying no trace of offense, no need to correct what had been said. How long since it last started clean? And the question landed differently then. She expected, not defensive, not submissive, just direct. And for a moment she did not answer, caught between irritation and something she could not quite name, before replying. This morning, maybe 8 hours ago, her tone clipped, still holding on to control, and he nodded once, barely noticeable, then gestured lightly toward the car without stepping closer. "Try it again," and she hesitated. Not because she doubted the instruction, but because she was not used to following directions from someone she had already dismissed. Yet something in his steadiness made refusal feel unnecessary. So she reached in and pressed the ignition, the engine turning over with a strained, uneven sound before cutting out again, shorter this time, weaker, and Marcus closed his eyes for a brief second, listening to the echo of it fade, mapping the failure in his mind without needing to touch a single component. And Lily watched him with quiet certainty, her small hand resting against the edge of the cart as if anchoring the moment. And Victoria stepped back, folding her arms, her expression tightening as doubt began to slip in around the edges of her confidence. Because this was no longer just a broken machine. This was something she did not immediately understand, and that unfamiliar space, that lack of instant resolution, made the air feel heavier. And when Marcus finally moved, it was not with urgency, but with intention, one step forward, then another, each motion measured, as if he had already decided the outcome and was simply letting time catch up to it. Marcus stopped just short of the front hood, not reaching for the latch, not even looking for it, his attention fixed somewhere deeper, somewhere beneath the polished surface that reflected the overhead lights in long, cold streaks. And for a moment it seemed as if he might do nothing at all, as if the entire interaction would dissolve into another unfinished attempt. But then he leaned slightly to the side, bringing his ear closer to the seam of the car without touching it. The distance no more than a few inches, close enough to catch what others would miss. And the garage seemed to quiet around him, or perhaps it only felt that way because his stillness demanded it. And Victoria watched with a growing tension she could not quite explain, her arms still crossed, but no longer rigid, her posture shifting from dismissal to observation without her permission, because there was no performance here, no exaggerated gesture, no sign that he was trying to impress or prove anything. Just a man listening as if the machine had something worth saying. And Lily remained where she was, her workbook forgotten now, eyes steady on her father, her expression calm in a way that suggested this was not unusual, that whatever was happening belonged to a pattern she already trusted. And after a few seconds, Marcus moved his head slightly, adjusting the angle, following the faint residual clicks inside the engine bay as they settled unevenly, his brow tightening just enough to register focus. And then he stepped back, exhaling quietly, not frustrated, not uncertain, simply concluding a thought. And when he spoke again it was almost to himself, but clear enough to be heard. It is not catching the relay clean. The words simple, unadorned, carrying no attempt to translate them into something more accessible. And Victoria frowned slightly, the terminology familiar yet unexpected in this context, because nothing about him had suggested technical precision, and yet there it was, delivered without hesitation, without explanation, and she found herself asking before she could stop herself. "You can tell that just by listening." And he glanced at her briefly then, not with challenge, not with pride, just acknowledgement, as if the question itself was reasonable but not particularly important. "You can tell when something is out of rhythm," he said, his tone even, almost quiet enough to disappear into the ambient noise. And that answer did not satisfy her, not fully, but it shifted something deeper than information, something about certainty, about the way he occupied the moment without needing to expand it. And before she could respond he crouched down slightly, not to inspect the engine directly, but to reach along the side panel near the front wheel, his fingers pressing lightly against a specific point as if confirming what he already knew. And the gesture was so precise it felt practiced, not rehearsed but lived, built over time rather than taught in steps. And Lily smiled faintly, a small, private expression that did not seek attention, because she recognized the moment before it happened, the quiet point where uncertainty gave way to resolution. And Victoria felt it too, though she could not name it yet. Only that the balance had shifted again, not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself, but enough that the man she had dismissed minutes ago no longer fit inside the assumption she had placed on him, and the space between them, once defined by status and certainty, now held something else, something quieter, something she was not used to standing inside. Marcus did not rush the moment. Even after reaching the conclusion, even after feeling the answer settle into place with the quiet certainty that came from experience rather than guesswork. And instead of opening the hood or asking for tools, he simply stood there for a second longer, as if giving the machine one last chance to disagree with him. But it did not. The faint ticking now fading into a pattern that confirmed what he already understood, and he straightened slightly before looking toward Victoria again, not to check her reaction, but to continue the process. "Try it one more time," he said, his voice steady, not instructive in a commanding way, but calm enough that it carried its own weight. And she hesitated again, though this time it was different, no longer rooted in dismissal, but in the unfamiliar feeling of placing trust where she had not intended to. And she moved back into the driver's seat, the leather cool under her hand, the interior suddenly quieter than before. And when she pressed the ignition, the engine turned over with the same uneven resistance for a split second before settling into a smoother rhythm, not fully stable, but noticeably closer. And she looked up immediately, something sharp in her expression, something that almost resembled surprise. And Marcus nodded once, as if the result matched exactly what he expected, then stepped closer to the side panel again, crouching just enough to reach the same spot he had touched before, his fingers pressing with careful precision, not forcing, not adjusting blindly, but applying just enough pressure to bridge what had failed internally, a temporary correction, not a permanent fix. And Lily watched with quiet focus, her head tilted slightly, her eyes following the exact placement of his hand, as if memorizing it without needing to ask. And the garage seemed to hold its breath again, the distant sounds fading into the background as the moment narrowed to something small but significant. And Marcus withdrew his hand after a few seconds, stepping back without announcing what he had done, without explaining the mechanics behind it, because for him it was not a performance, it was simply completion. And he gestured lightly once more. "Now," he said, and Victoria pressed the ignition again, this time the engine catching clean, the sound immediate and smooth, the kind of response that left no room for doubt, and it filled the space with a low, confident hum that echoed softly against the concrete walls. And she did not turn it off right away, her hands resting on the steering wheel as she listened, as if trying to understand not just that it worked, but how it had happened so quickly, so quietly, without the usual process she relied on. And when she stepped out again, there was a pause before she spoke, not because she did not have words, but because the ones she had used earlier no longer fit. And she looked at him directly now, really looked for the first time, noticing details that had been invisible before, the steadiness in his posture, the absence of urgency, the way he seemed entirely unaffected by whether or not she acknowledged him. And something in her expression softened, just slightly, not enough to change who she was, but enough to reveal that the certainty she carried had shifted. And for a brief moment she stood there without the shield of assumption, without the structure that usually defined every interaction. And in that space, small and unfamiliar, she understood that the problem had never been as simple as she believed. Victoria did not reach for her phone right away, which in itself felt unusual, almost out of rhythm with the way she normally moved through moments like this, where problems were solved and then immediately converted into the next action, the next call, the next decision. But instead she stood there beside the now steady hum of the engine, listening not to the machine anymore, but to the quiet that followed it. And Marcus had already stepped back, already returned to a space that did not demand attention, his hand resting lightly on the handle of the janitor's cart as if nothing significant had just happened, as if restoring something complex with nothing but observation and instinct was simply part of his day. And Lily closed her workbook gently, sliding it into her backpack with small, practiced movements before standing up beside him, her eyes moving briefly toward the car and then back to her father, a silent confirmation passing between them that required no words. And Victoria noticed that exchange, the ease of it, the absence of performance, and it unsettled her in a way she could not immediately define, because it did not fit into the structure she understood, where effort was visible and recognition was expected. And she finally spoke, her voice quieter now, less certain. "How did you know it? Was that?" And the question lingered in the space between them, not demanding but searching, and Marcus looked at her for a brief second before answering, his expression unchanged. "It sounded wrong," he said simply, and there was no elaboration, No attempt to translate the answer into something more technical or impressive, just a statement that felt complete on its own, and she exhaled slightly. A small release of tension she had not realized she was holding, because part of her expected more. Expected explanation or justification, something that would place him back into a category she could understand, but he did not offer it, and that absence forced her to sit with the answer as it was, incomplete in detail but complete in truth, and she reached into her bag then, pulling out her wallet with a reflex that came from years of resolving situations quickly, efficiently, placing value where value was due, and she held out a few bills toward him, not dismissive this time, but respectful, in its own structured way. "For your help," she said, and Marcus glanced at the money briefly before shaking his head once, not rejecting her, but declining the transaction. "It is all right," he replied, his tone steady, and she hesitated, the gesture unfamiliar on the receiving end, because refusal disrupted the balance she was used to maintaining, and for a moment she did not lower her hand, as if waiting for him to reconsider, but he had already turned slightly toward Lily, adjusting the strap of her backpack with a small, careful motion, his attention shifting fully away from the car, away from the problem that had already been solved, and in that moment Victoria understood something subtle but undeniable, that what he had done was never meant to be exchanged, never meant to be measured in the same way she measured everything else, and slowly. She lowered her hand, the bills still folded between her fingers, and watched as he began to move away, not hurried, not lingering, just continuing forward as if the moment had reached its natural end, and the engine behind her continued to run smoothly. A quiet reminder that something had changed, not just in the machine, but in the way she was beginning to see the space around her. Marcus did not look back as he walked, not out of indifference, but because the moment, to him, had already settled into its proper place, something finished and not meant to be revisited, and Lily matched his pace easily, her smaller steps quick but unstrained as she walked beside him, one hand lightly gripping the strap of her backpack, while the other brushed against the side of the cart, and the wheels rolled softly over the concrete, a steady rhythm that seemed to replace the sound of the engine behind them. And for a few seconds Victoria remained where she was, standing beside the car that now worked perfectly, yet feeling a subtle imbalance she could not ignore, as if something important had just passed through her world without asking permission, and before she fully understood why, she called out, "Wait," the word leaving her mouth quieter than she expected, not a command, not even urgent, just enough to reach him. And Marcus stopped, not abruptly, just a natural pause, and turned slightly, his expression unchanged, his posture still calm, as if being called back did not surprise him but also did not alter anything within him. And Lily looked up at her father briefly, then toward Victoria, her gaze curious but not wary, and Victoria took a step forward, closing a distance that now felt larger than it had a moment ago, and for the first time she seemed unsure of how to continue. Her usual precision in conversation replaced by something slower, more deliberate. "You said it is not the engine," she began, her voice measured. "Is it going to fail again?" And Marcus considered the question for a second, not because he needed time to think, but because he chose his words carefully. "It might," he said. "What I did was enough to get it running, but it should be replaced." And his tone carried no alarm, just quiet honesty, and she nodded slightly, absorbing that, then asked, "How long?" And he glanced toward the car briefly, as if listening again without moving. "Could be a day, could be a week," he replied. "Depends how it is driven." And there was something in that answer that felt different from the kind she usually received, not precise in numbers, not wrapped in guarantees, but grounded in reality in a way that required trust rather than control, and she exhaled softly, then gave a small nod. "Thank you," she said again, this time without hesitation, without structure, just the words as they were meant to be, and Marcus inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement, nothing more, and began to turn back, but Lily spoke first, her voice gentle, clear. "You should get it checked soon," she said, looking directly at Victoria, not instructing, not warning, just sharing what she understood, and Victoria blinked, surprised for a brief second, then gave a faint, almost reflexive smile. "I will," she replied, and Lily nodded once, satisfied, before stepping forward again beside her father, and they continued on, their figures gradually blending back into the quiet function of the garage, becoming part of the background once more, yet not invisible in the same way, not to her. And Victoria stood there for a moment longer, the engine still running behind her, the sound steady and reliable, but her attention no longer fixed on it. Because something in the simplicity of that exchange, in the absence of expectation, had left a mark she could not easily categorize. And as she finally reached into the car to turn off the ignition, the silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt different, as if it carried a presence that had not been there before, something quiet, something steady, something she had almost overlooked. Marcus stepped back fully, giving space to the car and to the silence that had settled around it. And Lily adjusted the strap of her backpack, walking a little closer to him without breaking the quiet rhythm they shared, their steps echoing softly against the concrete floor, blending into the low hum of the ventilation fans. And Victoria remained still, her hands lightly resting on the car roof, feeling the vibrations of the engine but noticing more the absence of tension, the calm that had replaced the impatience she carried in when she first arrived, and she realized she had not expected. Had not expected to feel a shift in the atmosphere, subtle and almost invisible, yet undeniable, as if the air itself had changed, and Marcus turned toward her briefly, not to speak but to acknowledge her presence with a simple nod, a gesture that carried no arrogance, no claim, just recognition that she was there and that the moment they had shared mattered only to the degree it needed to. And Victoria blinked, taking in the quiet dignity of the man she had dismissed, the way he moved and breathed as if measured not by titles or appearances, but by something deeper, something innate. And Lily glanced up at her father, her expression calm, trusting, a silent reminder of the bond they shared. And Victoria felt it too, that unspoken connection, a presence so steady it could not be ignored. And for the first time she wondered how often she had overlooked such qualities, how often assumptions had led her to misjudge. And she shifted slightly, her posture less rigid, less defensive, as she absorbed not just what had been done but the manner in which it had been carried out. And Marcus looked down briefly, eyes scanning the edge of the cart, then back at Lily, giving her a small, private smile, one that needed no explanation, and Victoria could not help but notice the simplicity of it, the absence of grandeur or showmanship, a lesson delivered quietly in action rather than words. And she realized that she had been holding her breath without knowing it, tension released in small increments, the kind that cannot be rushed or forced, only observed and understood in its unfolding. And she exhaled softly, feeling the tightness in her chest ease, and Marcus began moving again, slowly, deliberately, leading Lily toward the exit of the garage without a glance back at the car or at Victoria, the rhythm of their steps steady, unbroken, natural. And Victoria stood there, processing, feeling a subtle transformation in her perception, an awareness that respect and recognition did not require loud demonstration, that value could exist quietly, unannounced, and that sometimes the smallest gestures, the simplest actions performed without expectation, could teach more than 1,000 words or displays of authority. And she found herself adjusting her own posture slightly, taking in the moment, letting the quiet continue to speak, the presence of the father and daughter. Walking away, leaving an imprint not on the machine, but on her own understanding of patience, observation, and dignity. And for a long moment, she remained in that stillness, letting the echoes of what had transpired settle around her, realizing that the garage, the car, and the man who had fixed it had all quietly redefined her sense of what mattered. Victoria stayed in place, her hands resting lightly on the hood of the car, feeling the residual vibrations from the engine hum through the metal and into her fingertips. And for the first time in that garage, she allowed herself to breathe slowly, deliberately, noticing the subtle calm that had settled over the space, the way the harsh fluorescent lights no longer seemed sharp but diffused into a gentle glow across the concrete. And she realized she had been holding tension she did not fully acknowledge until now, the expectation of control, of immediate resolution, of always knowing the next step, all softening in the quiet left behind by Marcus and Lily. And she shifted her weight slightly, letting the heels of her shoes settle firmly against the floor, grounding herself in a way that had nothing to do with authority or status, but simply with presence, and she glanced toward the exit where they had walked. The pair now distant, but still unmistakably linked by movement and rhythm. Father and daughter moving together through the dim space. Marcus's posture steady, Lily's small steps perfectly timed to match his, and she found herself noticing details she would normally overlook. The slight sway of his jacket as he walked, the careful way he adjusted the strap of her backpack, the way he never glanced back unnecessarily, all small signs of care and competence that carried weight precisely because they were understated, unforced, unobserved by anyone else, and she felt a strange pull to understand more, not in the sense of dominating or controlling, but in simply seeing, comprehending the precision and quiet dignity of a life lived deliberately, and the hum of the engine behind her became background, a constant rhythm that underscored the lesson she was taking in without needing to analyze it. The soft echo of footsteps fading further down the hall marking the passage of the moment as complete, and she realized that she had been measuring value in a way that missed the subtleties of action, of presence, of consistency, and that those subtleties could speak louder than any title or command. And as she lowered her gaze from the exit to the car itself, she noticed the reflection of herself in the polished surface, her posture slightly softened, her expression thoughtful, and she acknowledged, silently, that respect did not always require demonstration, that recognition could exist quietly, organically, and that patience, observation, and dignity could shift perception without a word spoken, and she exhaled, letting the air of the garage absorb into her, feeling the stillness around her like a quiet teacher, the lessons of the last moments sinking in as she slowly stepped back from the vehicle, feeling grounded, aware, and changed in some imperceptible but undeniable way by the presence of the man and child who had walked through her assumptions and left clarity in their wake. Marcus and Lily continued toward the garage exit, their footsteps echoing softly against the concrete, and the distant hum of the ventilation fans blending with the fading echoes of the engine behind them, each step measured and calm, the child matching her father's pace with quiet precision, and Victoria remained near the car, standing still as the moment unfolded, feeling the weight of everything she had assumed slip away subtly, the rigid structures of her expectations softening in the face of what she had witnessed, and she watched as the pair moved through the dim light, the father's steady posture and the daughter's small, deliberate steps forming a rhythm that did not demand attention but naturally drew it, and she realized that respect, true respect, was not always loud or visible, that recognition could exist quietly, organically, and that the absence of assertion could be as powerful as any display of authority. And she inhaled slowly, letting the silence of the garage settle around her, the soft, continuous sound of the engine now only background to the imprint left on her perception. And for a long moment, she simply observed, noting the subtleties of movement, the deliberate care in the father's hand as he adjusted the strap of Lily's backpack, the measured, unhurried way he guided her without speaking, and the way he moved with intention yet without the need for acknowledgement. And she felt a small shift inside, a quiet understanding that some lessons are carried not in words but in action, in the consistent, unassuming presence of someone who does not need to prove their worth. And she thought about the assumptions she had made, the quick judgments, the impatience with what she did not understand, and now the simplicity of the moment, the humility and dignity it embodied, revealed a depth she had overlooked, and she lowered her gaze, noticing her own reflection in the polished surface of the car, posture slightly softened, expression thoughtful, and she realized she had learned something without being taught, that patience and observation, quiet strength and consistent care could alter perception more than any title or claim of authority. And Marcus and Lily reached the exit, stepping into the lighter corridor beyond, their figures framed against the fading glow of the garage, the sound of their footsteps merging with the natural rhythm of life outside the enclosed space. And Victoria remained a moment longer, absorbing the scene, feeling the quiet power of dignity and kindness, and then, finally, she turned away from the car, carrying with her the memory of a moment in which she had been shown, without ceremony or words, that true competence and care could exist quietly, and that the presence of a person who acts from integrity and patience could leave an impression far more enduring than any act meant to impress. And as she walked back toward her own life, the lesson lingered, subtle and persistent, shaping her thoughts and leaving a quiet moral that would not fade. He did not raise his voice, he raised her faith in people.